everybody and welcome. In today's video, I would like to present to you the essential sewing tools that I recommend you invest in if you are looking to get into sewing and you've never sewn before, because I know it can be hard to know where to start when you're just beginning, and also having the right tools makes such a huge difference and can save you a lot of time and frustration. And so I've created a list of 10 essential tools based on my personal sewing experience of about 7 to 8 years of making all kinds of things and testing out all kinds of tools. And these are the tools that have stood the test of time for me and that I reach for all the time and that are by my side in almost every single sewing project that I take on. And even if you have been sewing for quite a while and you already have lots of sewing experience, perhaps this will give you ideas on the sewing tools you'd like to maybe upgrade, or even for this upcoming holiday season, maybe you'd like to put together some essential sewing tools kits. I know that I've done that in the past before, and it's such a great gift when you know that someone is getting curious about getting into sewing, gifting them the essentials so they can get started. But before we begin, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Sarah. I mostly talk about sewing and my sewing projects on this channel, a little bit of knitting and embroidery when I dabble in them, and also a little bit of my personal life because I am originally from the East Coast of the United States. I now live and work in France, and I am a dual French and American citizen. And sometimes I share a little bit of my personal life to show you sometimes that side of my life, but also what inspires me creatively in case it inspires you too. So welcome. So without further ado, here are the essential tools that I've found really helpful in my practice that I highly recommend you invest in if you're looking to get into sewing. So the very first tool is the most obvious and also the hardest for me to recommend because it is a sewing machine. And it's hard for me to recommend because it really depends on where you live and what brands are available to you in your area, your budget, and then what you want to make. And also, I've only ever sewn with one brand, Janome. I've only ever had 2 sewing machines. I've never sewn on any other kind of machines, so I can't tell you which one's the best one. If you're not sure, there's a lot of online comparative tools that you can use, lots of blog posts. If you look it up, you'll find many. And if you can, a lot of sewing machine dealers are located inside craft stores and can answer all of your questions. You can test out the machines, and so I highly recommend doing that because in case you need to order a piece or have your machine serviced, it's important to have a brand that has services around where you are and not to order something very far away and not be able to get it serviced when something happens. But for what I use, I sew on the Janome Skyline S5, and I'm very happy with this machine. It has lots of different functionalities, and I've had it for about 5 years now, and I don't see myself replacing it. It works very, very well for me. And I started sewing out on a very basic Janome machine. It was the Janome Green 19 New Edition, but it was a very basic machine and one of the cheapest options for beginner sewists. I was able to do all kinds of stuff on it, as long as it has a back stitch, a straight stitch, a stretch stitch, and you know it can handle a certain amount of thickness for fabrics. I was able to sew stretch fabrics, bathing suits, coats, even jean fabric. And so there are many different brands that make basic machines for beginner sewists, and with most of them you'll be able to learn on that machine how to use a sewing machine, but also take on all different kinds of sewing projects when you're first starting out. So don't forget to look at the reviews online if you're purchasing online, or to go into stores and talk to the professionals who can walk you through which machine is best for your budget and what you want to make. But I don't think you can go very wrong. I think most of the big brands and their basic sewing machines for beginners are of good quality, and it's just which one's available to you in your area. And don't forget to look up the reviews. But I have always been very happy with my Janome machines, and I would highly recommend them if they are in your area. The next essential is your cutting tools, and there is a big debate between using scissors or a rotary cutter. Both of them have pros and cons. For example, scissors are much slower to cut with, and also this motion can sometimes aggravate any kind of wrist pain that you might have. But rotary cutters can also be sort of difficult because they can get expensive. You do need to replace the blade pretty often so that it doesn't get dull and start cutting whichever way when you're working with them. And also you have different types to get around small corners and things. This one's more of a larger one. I think it's 45 millimeters, and it's more for larger sort of cutting areas and not teeny tiny little corners. And then also you'll need a self-healing mat if you're going to work with a rotary cutter. I have 2. I have this one that I've been using for quite a long time, and I put it underneath my project, or I have another one that opens up to be double the size of that one. But I find that because I don't have the space to stock a larger rotary mat, I only use my rotary cutter for small projects that don't need to be moved, because the disadvantage of having such a small mat is that you have to move it underneath your project when you're cutting it, and that can kind of shift the fabric, especially if it's very slinky or if it moves a lot. And so I find that I most often reach for my scissors because I find that I have more control around curves and corners, and it's more precise. And then also I can keep my project stable and flat and kind of cut around it rather than having to move it so that I can cut it. But for example, if you have wrist pain or you make lots of small projects, for example, maybe you just want to make bathing suits or small jersey tops or underwear, then a rotary cutter will probably be much more practical, and it cuts a lot faster. So it's really up to you. I use the Clover rotary cutter because it's a little bit more ergonomic. It's got these little pads that help, but you can get it at a smaller price point and in different sizes as well. You have little ones that fit around teeny tiny corners much better. And then for scissors, I first started sewing with just average sewing scissors. The most important thing to remember about your scissors is that they should not be used on paper. They should be only used for sewing, because using them for all kinds of things like paper and cooking and things like that can dull the blade really quickly and nick the blade, and you want it to be nice and sharp so that you cut through the fabric without sort of tearing it or, I don't know, chewing on it. That can happen sometimes with sewing scissors that are dull. And this one, I think I paid under 20 euros for this one. It's just an average sewing scissor. And then for my birthday, I think a few years ago, my husband purchased these really nice Kai sewing scissors. They're the 7230 and they're 9 inches. And it has this sort of bend that makes it easier to cut flat. And I love them. They grip fabric really, really well. Even really shifty sort of polyester crepe fabrics, they grip them. They've got these teeny tiny micro teeth, I think. And yeah, it's just, oh, so nice. And I absolutely love the sound of scissors cutting through fabric. It just, it's a sensory experience as well. So I am definitely team scissors, but it really depends on what you're gonna make and what your style is. And both can be very practical in different situations. The second most important cutting tools are your embroidery scissors and your seam rippers. So your embroidery scissors are really practical for snipping threads when you're finished sewing a seam, or for just sort of cleaning up a project in general. I always have them next to me when I'm sewing. And then a seam ripper is exactly that. It's very practical for unpicking stitches when you've made a mistake and you want to take it apart. Although I actually, to be honest with you, I had to go looking for this one because I have not used a seam ripper in a very long time. And it's not because I don't unpick seams, I do all the time. It's just that I find that these embroidery scissors serve that purpose really well, and even better at unpicking seams than this one. I find that I have more control. Although you do have to be careful, this tip is very, very sharp and it can cut through fabrics or poke through fabrics really easily, and I've done that recently by mistake. But yeah, I use this as an unpicker, a thread snipper, and my embroidery scissors are really important. And so if you don't want to invest in both, I highly recommend first purchasing the embroidery scissors. You can get these for $10, $15 usually, and you can find them everywhere. But yeah, they're very important and they're very versatile. So I highly recommend having these if you want to start getting into sewing. The third tool you'll need, and it's also kind of an obvious one, it is pins. When you go looking, you will find all different kinds of pins. Glass-headed pins, plastic-headed pins, flat-headed plastic pins, pins for delicate fabrics, pins for silk fabrics, and also clips. And so the main two that you will probably see for beginner sewists are regular pins like this one that are the cheapest, and they are plastic headed pins, but I recommend first investing in glass headed pins. These are a very versatile everyday pin that you can use in a wide variety of projects with all kinds of different fabrics, especially with medium or heavyweight fabrics. They perhaps wouldn't work with a very thick coating fabric, but I've also used these with very fine fabrics and they've never ripped them or created big holes in them before, and so they're very practical. And then I recommend the glass-headed pins in particular because you can iron over them and they won't melt into your project. And I often use pins when I'm pressing, especially when I'm folding up a hem and pressing. I use pins to keep the fold in place, and it's just really practical knowing that I can get the iron nice and close to the pin and it won't melt. And so I highly recommend glass-headed pins. You'll find them everywhere. They're very basic, but they are super useful. So in addition to purchasing pins, you'll need somewhere to put them, and the most common object that you'll find for pins is a pin cushion. This is a very average pin cushion that I've had for years and years. It's full of stuff, but I highly recommend spending $1 or $2 more and finding a magnetic pin dish like this one. It is super useful. I keep it by my side at all times when I'm sewing because especially when I'm at the machine, I can just pull out the pins while I'm sewing and sort of fling it, not fling it, but drop it in the direction of the pin dish, and it grabs it, and I don't have pins flying around all over the place. I find very few pins on the floor, for example, and if I do by accident drop pins, I can very easily pick them up and they're not slipping through my fingers or sort of slipping through the cracks. I used to live in an apartment with parquet flooring, wood flooring, and there were big cracks between, and this saved my floors. It's just essential, and I have it by my side when I'm sewing all the time, and so I highly recommend investing in this as well. The next essential tool is a seam gauge, and this one is a very essential measuring tool. It helps you measure out small distances and seam allowances. It can help you measure the distance between buttonholes or buttonhole size so that you know where to space your buttons based on the size. You can do all kinds of things with these tools. For example, mine has inches on one side and centimeters on the other, which is really handy when I'm working with an American pattern versus a European pattern. You have these button shanks that help you create a little bit of ease when you're sewing on a button. You can draw circles with these, and then you can use them to measure certain distances. For example, this edge is 1 inch long, and then this one is 5/8 of an inch, which is the standard seam allowance in most sewing patterns. But you can also use this little tip to turn corners, and that can be super useful when you're making, for example, a collar or a waistband, turning out the little corners there. With this, you have to be very careful not to poke through, but this one usually doesn't poke through if you're careful enough. But yeah, I use this all the time, and I highly recommend investing in this one as well. The next tool is measuring tape. This is essential for knowing what your size is, measuring your size so that you know what size pattern you should be making. But you can also use it to measure length pretty easily if you want to check the length of a skirt before you make the pattern based on the indication of the skirt length on the pattern instructions. So you can determine whether or not you want to shorten or lengthen that pattern there, or for example in a bodice. You can also use it to make sure that when you're cutting out a pattern that your pattern pieces are on the grain line. That's really useful that way too. And I've had this measuring tape for years. It's really practical. You do have to make sure that you replace this every once in a while because it does sort of stretch out a little bit and then it's no longer accurate. But for now, it's kept its size for me, and it is super useful in all of my projects. The seventh essential tool that I'd like to mention is a quilting ruler. These are rulers that are like this. You can see this one's in centimeters, but I also have one in inches because I like to be well prepared for any kind of pattern that I encounter. And you can see it's sort of like these square-like. You can see inches this way, but also this way. And you can see the bias from here, and it is just super, super useful. And I mention this because not only is it more practical when you're cutting out a project and you want to measure a grain line and keeping your project on the grain line when you're cutting it out, but you can also use your measuring tape for that, and you may not necessarily need this right away. But I use these in almost every single project that I work on because I find that if you are motivated to start sewing your own clothes, you're probably motivated because you want to make clothes that fit your body. And almost no one fits into these standard sizes of sewing patterns, just like it's very hard to fit perfectly into the standard sizing in ready-to-wear. And both are similar in that way, and I found it very empowering to know how to fit my body. I know what different kinds of modifications I need to make, or for example, based on my style, if I want a hem to be longer or shorter, I use these rulers a lot. And so not only do I use these rulers, especially when I'm lengthening, like slashing a pattern and lengthening or shortening to make sure that it's nice and straight, but I also use this French curve, for example. I've had this for years. It's kind of getting a little bit dinged up, but I redraw lines with this one. So for example, my waist is typically 2 sizes smaller than my hips, and so I use this curved edge to grade between 2 different pattern sizes and to make sure that it follows the curve of the pattern or creates a new line that's a nice integrated curve. And I use this all the time. You can use it to redraw arm size as well, and it's just super useful. And so when you're getting into patterns, of course in your very first few projects you perhaps don't want to start manipulating them, but I found that I started manipulating and modifying patterns almost immediately when I started sewing because I wanted them to fit me right. And these are super, super useful to have in your toolkit. The next essential tool that I'll mention is this tracing paper. And this is kind of in the same vein of modifying the patterns as with the quilting rulers that I just showed you. This is typically when you want to trace a pattern. I use this all the time when I want to modify a pattern or create a custom size between 2 different sizes. And then this takes a lot of time, but what I like to do with patterns is purchase the PDF pattern so that I have all of the sizes, and not to cut it out directly on the computer paper, but to trace it so that I have all the sizes available to me, just in case I need to modify the size that I picked out, in case I made a size that was too big or too small and I want to start back at the beginning and regrade it to the right measurements based on the ease that I want in the garment. And that's a little bit complicated for beginner sewists, but you'll get it soon, I promise. And this tracing paper, especially ruled tracing paper, I find really, really useful. This is in centimeters and it helps me a lot. When I want to lengthen a pattern, for example, if I want to lengthen it exactly 5 centimeters, I can with this paper. Or to trace a pattern and make sure that it's on the grain line, I use one of these lines as the grain line. Then I have the grain line going through the entire pattern, which is super, super useful. I use this all the time, and I highly recommend investing in a rule as well. The second to last tool is a marking tool, and there are many different kinds of marking tools that you'll find. You'll find chalk wheels, chalk, pens that can write on fabrics, and I've tested almost all of them. And the ones that I come back to very often are just regular tailor's chalk. They come in these sort of very traditional colors. You'll find it most often in white, but then also in yellow and blue. I most often use the yellow one. I've had this one for years. It's not as chalky as it is waxy, and it stays on the fabric until you wash it, so it doesn't sort of brush off like a chalk powder would. And the white shows up on most fabrics, but then when I'm using a white fabric, I will use the yellow one, and I will occasionally use the blue one as well, but I most often use the white one. And these are pretty inexpensive. You can find them pretty easily, and you can use the rough side for marking particular spots in a pattern, or you can shave down this lengthy side and draw straight lines with this side. And it's just super, super useful, inexpensive, and it is the one that I use the most often in my sewing practice. And so I highly recommend investing in this one as well. And the very last sewing essential that you'll need if you're beginning sewing are hand sewing needles. Hand sewing needles are essential for doing the finishing touches on your projects. For example, tacking down a facing, or sewing on a button, or hand sewing a hem, for example. And hand sewing is often the extra touch that makes your hand sewn clothes extra qualitative and super special. And so I've been using this assortment of different sizes, and I highly recommend buying an assortment so that you can get a feel of which one you prefer in terms of length and also thickness, but that will also work with lots of different kinds of fabrics. I've been using this Clover pack that I purchased in Japan when I was in Tokyo 2 years ago, and they last a pretty long time. I've got different sizes, and these are sizes 7 to 10, which work for medium to fine fabrics, just about. And so they're the most practical, and I really enjoy this brand, but also I've used Bohin before, B-O-H-I-N, which is a French brand, and there are lots of different brands that create great sewing needles. It really depends on your personal style and what kind of needle you prefer in terms of length and also thickness, and so don't hesitate to go and test out a few, but these are my favorite. And then as an extra tip for hand sewing, I highly recommend investing in a little piece of sewing wax. This is something that I purchased years ago. You can see it's getting kind of tacky and it's falling apart, but you use it by running your thread through it so that the wax rubs on the thread 2 or 3 times, and then you use heat to sort of set it into your thread, and it makes your thread super strong for sewing, for example, buttons or buttonholes. I use it mostly with all of my hand sewing just to make sure that the thread doesn't break and it's extra strong. It keeps threads from getting tangled or breaking while you're hand sewing, and it's just super useful to have and really inexpensive as a tool that lasts a very, very long time. So I highly recommend investing in this as well. So there you have it. Those are the essential sewing tools that I recommend if you're looking to get into sewing. I have linked all of the tools that I've mentioned in the description below, and I've linked a few different ones to help you out and give you some options. If you think I've missed an essential and there's something that you use that you find essential in your sewing practice, don't hesitate to mention it in the comments below. That way we can take this conversation even further, and perhaps I'll learn something from you as well. I will be continuing this series of advice for beginner sewists with a new video very soon on the beginner patterns and pattern makers that I recommend for people who would like to start sewing. So watch out for that video very soon. Don't hesitate to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss any new videos from me. And I will see you here very soon with a new video. Thank you for watching, take care, and bye-bye.